Okay, let's start hacking web applications. The first module is understanding web application concepts. So, introduction to web applications. Web applications provide an interface between end users and web servers through a set of web pages that are generated at the server end or contain script code to be executed dynamically within the client web browser. Though web applications enforce certain security policies, they are vulnerable to various attacks such as SQL injection, cross-site scripting, and session hijacking, etc. So, how web applications work? The main function of web applications is to fetch user requested data from a database. When a user clicks or enters a URL in a browser, the web application immediately displays the requested website content in the browser. This mechanism involves the following steps. First, the user enters the website name or URL in the browser. Then the user's request is sent to web server. On receiving the request, the web server checks the file extension. If the user requests a simple web page with an HTML or HTML extension, the web server processes the request and sends the file to the user's browser. If the user requests a web page with an extension that needs to be processed at the server side, such as PHP, ASP, CFM, then the web application server must process the request. Therefore, the web server passes the user's request to web application server, which processes the user's request. The web application server then accesses the database to perform the requested task by updating or retrieving the information stored on it. After processing the request, the web application server finally sends the results to the web server, which in turn sends the results to the user's browser. So next we will see web application architecture consists of three layers: client or presentation layer, business logic layer, database layer. And so let's look at what is a client or presentation layer. It includes all physical devices present on the client side, such as laptops, smartphones, computers, etc. These devices feature operating systems and compatible browsers, which enable users to send requests for required web applications. The user requests a website by entering a URL in the browser, and the request travels to the web server. The web server then responds to the request and fetches the requested data. The application finally displays this response in the browser in the form of a web page. Business logic layer contains two layers: web server logic layer and business logic layer. Web server logic layer contains various components such as firewall, HTTP request parser, a proxy caching server, an authentication and login handler, a resource handler, and a hardware component, example a server. Business logic layer includes the functional logic of web application, which is implemented using technologies such as .NET, Java, and middleware. So here the key is it includes the functional logic of the web application. So this is the layer where the actual functionality of the web application is performed. So this is about business logic layer. So next is database layer. Consists of cloud services, a B2B layer that holds all commercial transactions, and a database server that supplies an organization's production data in a structured form. Example, Microsoft SQL Server, MySQL Server, etc. Next, we will see web services. A web service is an application or software that is deployed over the internet and uses standard messaging protocols such as SOAP, UDDI, WSDL, and REST to enable communication between applications developed for different platforms. Some information about the protocols that we discussed. SOAP It's a full form for Simple Object Access Protocol. SOAP is a messaging protocol specification for exchanging structured information in the implementation of web services in computer network. UDDI, Universal Description, Discovery and Integration. UDDI specification defines a way to publish and discover information about web services. So basically, it's like a user manual for a web service. The web services description language WSDL, also called as WSDL. It is an XML based interface description language that is used for describing the functionality offered by a web service. So the functionality of a web service is described in the form of a XML language. So REST or RESTful API. Representational state transfer is a software architectural style. It's an architectural style that describes a uniform interface between physically separate components, often across the internet in a client server architecture. Web service architecture. So we saw some of the protocols used in web services. Now let's see web service architecture. So a web service architecture describes the interactions among the service provider, service requester, and service registry. These interactions consist of three operations, namely publish, find, and bind. There are three roles in a web service. Service provider. It is a platform from where services are provided. Service requester. It is an application or client that is seeking a service or trying to establish communication with a service. In general, the browser is a requester which invokes the service on behalf of a user. Service registry. It is the place where the provider loads service descriptions. The service requester discovers the service and retrieves binding data from service descriptions. There are three operations in a web server architecture: publish, find, and bind. Publish. During this operation, service descriptions are published to allow the requester to discover the services. So the services, what kind of operation it does, are published in the in this architecture layer. Next is find. During this operation, the requester tries to obtain the service descriptions. This operation can be processed in two different phases: obtaining the service interface and description at development time, and obtain the binding and location description calls at runtime. Bind. During this operation, the requester calls and establishes communication with services during runtime using binding data inside the service description to locate and invoke the services. So this is the diagram for web service architecture. So as you can see, the service requester finds a service using a for service registry. The service registry will contain what are all the services a particular service can perform. So the service requester uses UDDI WSDL. These are the protocols that is exchanged between service requester and service registry, that is UDDI and WSDL. And even find. The service requester can use find to obtain the services that are available. Next, the messages exchange between service registry and service provider are publish, UDDI, and WSDL. So next, the messages exchange between service requester and service provider is a bind. The service provider, as already said, it contains the actual services and the service descriptions. So to understand in a better way, let's see a case study of a web service architecture for a balanced inquiry service. So here the service is balance inquiry. So At the beginning, the starting point is service provider. Service provider is an entity who is interested in sharing their services to consumer. Here, the consumer is service requester. For example, a bank wants to provide a service called balance inquiry services to consumer. The bank develops this service and stores in its repository. After developing and storing, a document is developed called Web Service Description Language (WSDL). This document, which is in XML, is registered in registry called Service Registry. So in service registry, the service description WSDL is registered by service provider, and that service is registered into universal description, discovery and integration. So the messages exchange between service provider, service registry and service requester is SOAP protocol messages. UDDI provides unique name for the service, that is balance inquiry service. Service requester sends query to service registry. We can also say to UDDI to check if a particular service is available using SOAP protocol. Service registry, that is UDDI, responds using WSDL specification or document. Now the service requester requests a service request based on the response to service provider. From service request from the service request fetches the balance and gives it to service consumer. This operation where requester calls and establishes communication with the services during runtime is called bind. So vulnerability stack, as you can see, this vulnerability stack has 7 layers: security, network, operating system, database, web server, third-party components, and custom web applications. And each layer there are a set of vulnerabilities. So, and the related tools or vulnerabilities are shown on the right side of the document. Like the first layer, that is security layer, IPS and IDS are used. In layer 2, router and switch are used, and their respective vulnerabilities can be found. In layer 3, operating system, we can see Windows, Linux, OS X. In layer 4, database, Oracle, MySQL, MS SQL. Layer 5, web server, Apache, Microsoft IIS. And then layer 6, third party components, open source, commercial. And layer 7, custom web applications. So here the we can see business logic flaws, technical vulnerabilities, etc. So the attacker exploits the vulnerabilities of one or more elements among the 7 levels to gain unrestricted access to an application or the entire network. Hint to remember 7 layers: CTW dons. So next, in the next video we'll see the next module, which is web application threats.